Welcome to the first in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey, a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher, to discuss the Panchavati Discourses. My name is Rob Meager. I'm an interfaith minister. I lead a spiritual ministry initiative in Ottawa, Canada called Spiritual Guidance, and have been a student of Richard Harvey's work since 2012. Today's interview will discuss the Panchavati Discourses as a whole. This six-part series was originally brought in March-April of 2013, and each subsequent interview in this series will explore in more detail each one of the lectures in the Panchavati Discourses. The manuscripts for these discourses are an ebook entitled Dharma Sky, which is available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. Dharma Sky is one of a trilogy of 3 ebooks, each containing 14, totaling 42 lectures. Another one of those ebooks is entitled Moksha Dawn, and the third ebook is entitled Bodhi Ocean, and is currently in production. Again, all ebooks are available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. And you can also listen to the full recording of each of the lectures in this series online through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. And now I'd like to provide you with a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. He's a psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century. And at the center of Richard's offering is a psychospiritual way for the modern era that is the 3 stages of awakening. The 3 stages are, first, the liberation of the individual from personal childhood conditioning and patterns of survival. Second, the opening and emergence of the heart of compassion, awareness, and authenticity. And lastly, the sacred spiritual preparation for a genuine spiritual practice of awareness or devotion in realizing the true self within the divine source of being, and the Mahanaman, or disintegration into the heart of reality itself. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and the Flight of Consciousness, among other publications, and he works with people all over the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. It's now my pleasure to welcome and invite to the call Richard Harvey. Welcome, it's good to be with you as always.
Hi.
We're talking today about the Panchavati Discourses as a whole. Again, I mentioned 6 discourses within this series, all contained within this beautiful ebook, Dharma Sky, which I have by my side, that I may refer to in this interview. And I want to begin, as we start a new series, as I have with the start of the previous series, and ask you, where did you receive the inspiration for the title of the series? Again, the word Panchavati may be new to some people.
Yes, the Panchavati was a glade of trees where Sri Ramakrishna in the 19th century, he had planted the trees. He would go and often be in samadhi, and if you ever glance at the wonderful book, The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you'll see that various meetings with significant people in his life narrative took place there in the Panchavati. It's also amazing to look at now because there's these extraordinary trees with gigantic roots and beautiful, beautiful pictures. I've never been there, but it struck me as a lovely symbol, this a location, shall we say, for samadhi. So that was my thought.
And there's a picture, I believe, in the ebook of Dharma Sky of this grove of trees. This grove at Panchavati. A curious question: what types of trees were they? Was there a significance in the type of tree?
Oh, there was, and I forget what they are now. I'm not very good on names and labels, I'm afraid, but they're beautiful.
Okay. Why did you choose these 6 seminar titles? And I'll repeat them for the benefit of those listening to the interview. The first is The Heart of Compassion. Second, How the Soul is Born into the World, which is really part 1 of a 3-part lecture on how the soul is born into the world. And the second part of how the soul is born into the world was Authentic Love and the Birth of the Soul. And then the final of that 3-part is The Intuition of Reality. The 5th lecture in the 6-part series is The End of Seeking. And the last lecture in the series is The Threshold of Transformation. And I know I've shared some of these lectures with a group of people here in Ottawa as part of my spiritual ministry initiative. And the titles alone captivated them. And certainly the content did as we shared, throughout the gathering. But why did you choose those 6 seminar titles? Where did those titles come from?
The way that I remember this and all the other lecture series so far coming about is much more like painting than it is like some academic exercise. I really don't think very much about them or about the content of it. And I mean, this may strike some people listening as odd because, I know that over the years I would hear spiritual teachers and spiritual masters, they say, well, nobody is speaking and no one's thinking, and you're there and you're saying, well, the guy's talking. I mean, what does he mean? No one's thinking, no one's talking, no one's speaking. But it is rather like how it is. I simply sit down and something comes or it doesn't come, and then the lecture would evolve from that, and then at some point it feels finished. And it is it's a right brain exercise, if anything. It's not a left brain exercise. It's an exercise in surrender and letting go and seeing what appears on the page, so to speak. So with the kind of structure of the titles for the Panchavati series, I don't remember struggling terribly much, but just having a feeling of opening as much as I possibly could to the truth. And then these lovely words, these lovely titles would appear, Authentic Love or End of Seeking, all this kind of thing, and they were just there, and it was like those trees. It's just this seemed to form a glade. This seemed to form a safe or a integrated space for samadhic exercise of some sort, and I was as captivated with it as probably your people are too. Mm-hmm. So it really is like that. It really is. I'm just confessing to you that it isn't a egoic exercise, where I sit down feeling, well, that's a great title I thought of. Right. It just comes to me rather as a gift. Mm-hmm. And I think rather like painting or sculpting or music or something like this, it's much more aligned to that than it is to academic. And that's partly why along the way, as we progressed through the series, this lecture word fell away somewhat and this discourses word came in, which just seemed more gracious somehow and, you know, more opening than I'm telling you something through the talk.
Yeah. More aligned with a satsang than a than a lecture. And you know, I'll share again how some of the titles in these lectures have attracted a new community of people here in Ottawa. In particular, the one that's coming up very shortly is The End of Seeking, and it's attracted a new community of people, which I find very interesting, and I wanted to share that with you. Tell me and tell us a little about each of these lectures. What could one expect or hope to hear from? The Heart of Compassion, How the Soul is Born into the World, Authentic Love and the Birth of the Soul, The Intuition of Reality, The End of Seeking, and The Threshold of Transformation. If you took each one of those, starting with the Heart of Compassion, how would you sum it up in a couple of sentences?
One of the things I would like to say about all of the topics is it seems to me that what comes through from me, because I'm a practical essentially, I'm a down-to-earth kind of being, that one thing that interests me or that comes through in the work that leads to the discourses is this bridging the gap really between, you know, taking ancient timeless truths and delivering them in a way that's pertinent, that's relevant. So whether it was transformation or love or the birth of the soul, it seems to me extraordinarily important that first, it's not just regurgitating, you know, the old truths. It is, in a sense, regurgitating the old truths, but they weren't listened to for 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years and so on. So why would they be now? The answer is we have different ears, we have different ways of hearing, different ways of thinking, for sure. And if I have a hope for the Panchavati and other discourses, it is that they communicate, that they actually connect. It's difficult sometimes reading ancient scriptures and looking at ancient forms of enlightened beings' lives and realizing you don't honestly identify with them terribly. You don't necessarily even understand very much about what's being said, and certain things appeal to us and other things don't, and so we pick and choose somewhat. But in the Panchavati, I'm trying to say authentic, timeless truths in a way we can hear it in this modern era.
You mentioned just a minute ago something that intrigued me. And as you said it, I recognized it as a truth, that the way we hear, see, and think today is different than 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Why is that?
I think it's a complex matter. There's a lot to say about it, but the principal thing to say about it is the turn of events in human history that bridge the 19th into the 20th centuries, which, you know, I've spoken about here and there quite a lot, and I think in some of these interviews, and everything changes, absolutely everything changes. But in summary, what happens is we come to have a very different view of ourselves as individuals come the early 20th century. You know, whether we are in whatever strata of society you were in, you started to see yourself differently because of all the forces that were impacting on as it were, modern life at that time, and forces that were unique, things that simply hadn't happened before. And it involved a self-consciousness, whether it were a reflection from the movies, and the popularization of recreation, where we read and we saw images and paintings, and increasingly through that century these things became open to more and more people, whether it was that people started to go on holiday, for example, and through the 20th century more and more this idea of having a holiday, so going to other cultures, which then reflected things back to oneself, or whether Western psychology, which, whether you were involved directly or not, of course, had this way of seeping through, like philosophy has this way of seeping through, or physics, for that matter, has a way of seeping through into the popular mind, even if you're not formally studying it in any shape or form. The seeping in of psychology led to a self-reflection, if you will, and what we saw, I think, then was an individual, and we saw an individual in a way that we hadn't seen the individual in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. We saw it in a way in which what I call the ego complex, or the ego processes, which comprise that idea of the individual, because it's merely an idea, and the fact that it's so hard to grasp now tells us, you see, we've had over 100 years now thinking this way, of being educated this way, of in all sorts of insidious ways, being made to think of ourselves as identifiable and separate. Commercialism, advertising, of course, propaganda of all kinds, continues to reinforce more and more this idea of myself in the world, and myself separate from the world, and myself identifiable, separate, and divided from other people, from other nations, from other people who are not like me, and of course from the rest of the world. So we don't think of ourselves as, for example, part of nature, which it wouldn't take very much to bring up a simple argument to show that that's the case. And then when you look at the rest of the nature and you say, well, is this a lawn of grass, or is this a lot of separate blades of grass? See, that's just a way of looking at it. It's just a perspective, and we have been indoctrinated into this perspective of the individual. So this is the overriding difference.
What I'm hearing in part, and you used the words yourself in responding just now, over the past several thousand years, we've established a different relationship with the ego, or a new ego relationship or dynamic has come to the fore over the past several thousands of years because of all of these influences. Again, going back to the comment you made that we hear, see, and think differently now than we did 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. This being in part the impetus for you bringing back the truths. And yes, they're being regurgitated, but the way they're communicated, to say in a new way may not be accurate, but in a way hopefully that in this time it can allow people to see things differently.
Yeah. Was there a question?
Just a confirmation that we could sum up what you shared, that we've established a new relationship with the ego over the past, well, even 100 years, let alone the past several thousands of years.
And I think that's I mean, yes, you have it right, you have it correct. It's certainly what I'm saying. But I would shy away in some ways of this ghost in the machine idea. You know, we have formed a new relationship with the ego. It has this kind of object-subject thing going on. And really what's happening is when we, from our point of view, consider ourselves individuals, when we then start to talk about the ego, we kind of reinforce it with another veil, and then people start to talk about, you know, what they're doing with their ego. And the fact is, the person who's doing something with the ego is the ego. You know, there isn't a something else that you're doing, and this is hardly a new idea, but I think we have to be careful of how we talk about it, because it will reinforce something inside. And then you get people in psycho-spiritual work, so to speak, wrestling with an ego or struggling with an ego. That's what you are. I mean, that's what you are until you've seen through that delusion. So who's struggling with what? What's struggling with who? So you create a ghost. I mean, you know, Alan Watts has pointed this out in The Wisdom of Insecurity when he said, you know, we have certain semantic constructions, such as, for example, it rains, or il pleut, and il pleut, it rains. It's like, he says nothing's raining. Really, much more correct would just be to say raining. And he goes on to point out that really things are verbs. And so in this way, I prefer to talk about the ego processes, because it is these activities that are defining the idea of ego, which is not really, strictly speaking, a noun. You know, we may talk about it like that, but it's not a noun. And even if it were a noun, it isn't other than our delusion of ourselves.
I want to go back to explore a little further, although understanding that each of the subsequent interviews in this series is going to dive into each of the interviews. But I mentioned earlier in this interview, or dive further into each one of the lectures. Earlier in this interview, I spoke about, of the 3 lectures in this series, of the 6 lectures in this series, there's 3 that are in effect, it's part 1, part 2, and part 3. And it begins with how the soul is born into the world. And then part 2 is authentic love and the birth of the soul. And then part 3 of that series within the series is the intuition of reality. And I remember having to read the manuscripts multiple times to start to appreciate on a very deep level what you were offering with this 3-part lecture as part of the 6 lectures in the discourse. And to sum it up, and you spoke about this in part 1, which was how the soul is born into the world. The soul is born into the world through 3 dark veils. The first is thought, the second is separative relationships, and the third is nature. So how the soul is born into the world talks about the first veil, thought. Authentic love and birth of the soul speaks about the second veil, separative relationships, or more simply, all relationships. And the third part, the intuition of reality, speaks about, through intuition, or as part of intuition, the third veil is that of nature. For me anyway, how the soul's born into the world through thought and separative relationships, or all relationships, made a lot of sense to me. But when I came to part 3, and because remember, you should share that it's through these 3 dark veils that the soul is brought into the world. Well, to me, I can see how thought is a dark veil vis-a-vis our ego. And I can certainly see how relationships, many, some, maybe all, is a dark veil. I mean, certainly an amazing breeding ground for our learning. But it was the third one, the intuition of reality and the nature being a dark veil as a gateway to the soul being born into this world. Can you speak about nature, about this third dark veil, as being one where the soul is born into the world?
It's I can. This reminds me of dividing God, dividing the divine source, where we have it's very interesting when we come up against these prejudices, isn't it? Where you are, I can't throw nature out. I mean, I can throw out the relationship thing because they're so full of darkness so often. I mean, thought, easy, that's the mind, that's the ego, that is the ego processes. But hey, nature, I want to keep the trees,
Right, yeah, exactly.
And and it brings up the vision of lots of Jewish stories where the old guy's sort of lying there dying, and just before he dies, he jumps up and says, don't forget to give 2 chickens to Jacob or something, I owe him, and then he drops dead. It's the way in which we're attached to the world. I mean, any attachment that you have is assumably going to appear then when you die, and here's one of them, and a very big one, a very profound one. Just before I talk about it, though, just to say that what I remember about these talks and the group that we had listening was it was very interactive, this period, off the back of the Sashtipurthi things. There was a lot of questions, there was a lot of interaction, there was a lot of cross-fertilizing of ideas and stuff like this, and that's actually why it wasn't premeditated in any shape or form that the birth of the soul in the world would sort of splice into these 6 talks. It came, as I recall, from questions and interaction. And so it was lovely that somehow, when I came to review it for assembling the transcripts for Dharma Sky, that I realized it had fallen into this lovely pattern that somehow had to be recognized, which is why I emphasize how the soul is born into the world, parts 2 and 3. It's just so much of it had been taken over by that, it almost seemed like a mistake, and then I realized it wasn't a mistake, it was just a lovely sort of piece of lattice work, really, Right. So nature is basically the answer is this. I mean, everything that appears in the realms of time and space, until you are clearly aware that it's shot through with the truth, that it's absolutely saturated in the truth, you have to give it up in its brittle, time, space, limited appearance. So in other words, nature, not only in its beauty, which we're very fond of, but of course in its incredible brutality, violence, and it completely inhuman aspect, all of it has to be let go of, just the same as anything else that will keep you in the grey realm of duality. Grey realm of duality is where there's this and that. And there's always this and that, as we know, heaven and earth, sky and ground, day and night, you and me, blah and blah, love and hate and so on. And what we're inclined towards is, well, I love love, I don't really want hate, and, I like the daytime, a bit afraid at night time or something like that. And we want to splice it down the middle. You cannot make pieces out of the divine source, you see. So whenever there's anything to do with duality itself, it's got to go. And the more you can argue for its reflection in God and the fact that it is the sunset is wonderful. It's beautiful. It's not eternal. the sun is a symbol of consciousness or God or the divine source. It isn't in and of itself anything more than a whole mass of nuclear explosions on a gigantic star, which is giving life to our universe. I mean, it's a physical matter. And it will not always be here, any more than this earth will always be here. But when we're talking of eternity, you always have to see through this duality of day and night, life and death, the sun shining and the sun not shining. I remember talking with a Zen Roshi about exactly this business of the sun and this idea of nuclear power and nuclear fission and the exchange of hydrogen and helium and all this kind of thing, and exactly what it was. And we were talking about this very interesting point that, nuclear explosions are a bad thing. Look at Nagasaki, look at Hiroshima, and so on and so on. Hang on a minute, they're not a bad thing, because without nuclear explosions, no sun, no life, no earth, no universe, we wouldn't have it, you see. Without nuclear explosions, they are our God. We are beholden to nuclear fission. So it's not bad, it's a contextual business. When it comes to nature, as much beauty, as much ugliness as it is, and as hard as it may be to grasp and come to terms with, you have to transcend it. A nature religion is a primitive kind of version of trying to see into the nature of things, into the eternal nature, into the deathless realms. And it is, of course, fascinating and interesting as historical artifacts when you look back at Frazier's The Golden Bough and, books like this. It's fabulous, but it's not an in-depth spiritual teaching like in the Upanishads or the, the Vedas or, other scriptures by any means. It's a very primitive, young way of looking at things. We have to go beyond nature because we are part of nature and we partake of this world of duality, coming and going. That's not the divine source.
Thank you for offering that, and I'm trusting that that those listening will appreciate more what you're sharing, because I know the first time I came across the lecture online and then reread the manuscripts, it was still difficult for me, which was my own indication as to what I was holding on to. But I can remember in reading through the manuscript saying, okay, here's yet another example where you, Richard, have not held back with other lectures in sharing things that could be perceived in traditional, if I can use that word, spiritual realms as truths. In fact, it really challenges that. And this lecture in particular, with its focus on the third veil nature, was one of them. And I'm going to paraphrase here, although I'm going to try and be as diplomatic as I can when we actually talk about the lecture specifically. In a few interviews from now, we'll get into quotes, but I remember you saying, and again I'm paraphrasing, even those spiritual practices that are centered around nature need to let go of that practice because it's keeping them in that dualistic existence. And it was for me, again, without naming any specific traditions or practices that that focus and center around nature, it was a bit of a shock to the system, to hear this, and I just thought, there's another example where in your teachings, it's not the first time if people have been following your teachings, you invite another way to look at these spiritual truths and these spiritual teachings. The last two titles in this lecture series, the Panchavati Discourses, are equally enticing if I can use that word. The end of seeking and the threshold of transformation. And for those who have followed your work or following it now, and primarily I'm thinking of Your Essential Self, your book, which accounts or presents an account of the 3 stages of awakening, which is your therapeutic model as part of sacred attention therapy. The end of seeking leads you could say the end of seeking leads one through the threshold of transformation from that stage 1 into stage 2. They're very, I found, revealing lectures. Again, I've noticed that a different community of people are being attracted to these lectures than earlier ones, and even earlier topics and discussions I've held. What is the draw for people, for the masses, to this idea of the end of seeking and the threshold of transformation, even if they're not familiar with your work? This idea of the end of seeking seems to be a magnet that draws people in. There's something in that people are attracted to. What do you think it is?
Can I just make one observation first, and that is you're right and not right about this business of the end seeking leads to threshold transformation. It does, but over the other side of the threshold you're seeking something else. That's also true, because one of the things that does seem to be misunderstood about my work is that the second stage of awakening is still an ego stage. What you're seeking is entirely different, but you're still seeking. Now in the third and fourth stages there is no seeking as such. And to go now direct to the question, I think the end of seeking has a resonance with people because in a way it summarizes something they don't want to hear. In a way they can hear it, because the end of seeking is really calling closing time on the ego. See, the ego seeks. The ego seeks. There isn't something else in us that seeks. There is something else, but it doesn't seek. So when you say the end of seeking, there's a proposition there. There's an assumption, if you will, that there's something other than the ego. And there is also a definition. As I said before, when we talk about the ego, it's a kind of ghost, which is why we so often have to identify with it or struggle with it or whatever we do with it, as if it's something. It's just a point of view, and it's just an incorrect point of view. So, you can work with it all you will, but what you work with it for is to see that it's a pretender. It's just like the Wizard of Oz when the old guy's behind on the levers and the lights and the mirrors and the whole drama, which is a spectacle, is caused by this little old man with the levers saying, don't believe people when they say, it's not real. Well, it isn't real. And we haven't believed people for a very long time who've said it isn't real. And one of the ways of saying it very succinctly is, look, what if there's an end of seeking? What if you, as a consciousness in individual form, don't have to be restless anymore? And what you notice about the stream of enlightened beings, male and female, through hundreds and then thousands of years, not all whom have taught, and not all of whom we know, but there they are, and they're usually sitting around, actually. That's what the wonderful thing about Ramakrishna, Ramana Maharshi, the rest, I know, just going to talk about my favorites, but, and the rest, is yes, some of them wrote poetry and some of them did art of some kind, and maybe they did meditations and this, that and the other, whatever, but a lot of the time they're just sitting around. Nityananda is constantly portrayed in various photographs, very old photographs now, just sitting on his bed. it seems that he walked a little bit here and there, but he just seems to be sitting there. And then the people come and sit around. Ramana Maharshi had this great couch thing, and he's just sitting on it. He's not even doing meditation per se. He's reading letters, and everybody would come in and sit around with him sitting around, because there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, there's no one to do anything anymore. So this is the end of seeking, this is the transcendence. And so you can define this moment when the ego's defeated as the end of seeking, because it's only the ego that seeks, and it's only this point of view of lack that has us doing anything. That's why it's so tremendously important, if you're, just as an aside, that if you're going to be involved in spirituality and teachers and all that kind of thing, you look carefully and see, are they doing this stuff? Or is this coming through in some way? And can you feel that as well as hear it? Because it's very easy to say it. So getting back to the beginning of our talk, when you said about the titles and all of this, I'm saying it is not an egoistic concern, and if it was, I'd just do something else. The ego can do many things. I'd just do something else. Why do this? This must come through truth, divine intervention itself. Otherwise it's simply not worth doing. So that way it's resonant with truth, it's bright with what's real. And the end of seeking means that we are not trying to do anything with any of it anymore. There's no insistence, really. There's no sort of self-aggrandizement about the titles or the discourses or the teachings or the ideas or any of this. Just a delight in clarity, and just a delight in the impossibility of speaking divine truth through words and space and time. It's an impossible thing to do, and the only things that are worth doing in space and time are the impossible things. Don't you think?
Beautiful. And let's leave it on that beautiful note, because we're out of time. When we come together the next time, we'll start in with the first lecture in the series and talk about the heart of compassion. But let me remind people that if they're interested in the manuscripts, they're contained in an ebook entitled Dharma Sky. That's available on the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. And the full recordings of each of the lectures in the series also available online through the Sacred Attention Therapy website, www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. Thank you, Richard, and until the next time.
Look forward to it. Bye-bye, Ra.
Bye-bye.